Hello, this is part 3 of OHC Module 1. In this part we're looking at exposure standards and information sources, and some of this is really listing, but resources that you're going to need to understand, and a lot of these will be referred back to in further modules in more detail. Total removal of all potentially harmful agents from the workplace is the only absolute method of assuring worker health and safety. Since this optimum is not always possible, exposure standards have been set to quantitatively define exposure levels to assist in ensuring that workers are adequately protected from agents, chemical, physical or biological, that impair health or cause undue annoyance or discomfort. And in Australia we have the Hazardous Substances Information System, which provides exposure standards for airborne contaminants that you need to be aware of. Exposure standards should always be used as a guide, and they're a guide for controlling exposure to hazardous substances in the workplace, and they represent the exposures to which it's believed that nearly all workers may be subjected to day after day during their working lives without suffering adverse effects. However, because of the wide variation in individual susceptibility, exposure of some individuals in a given population may not prevent annoyance, aggravation or aggravation of a pre-existing condition or physiological damage at or even below the exposure standard. Exposure standards are generally based on data arising out of experimental animal and human studies, and from that data or industrial experience obtained through clinical and epidemiological studies of workers, which is often studies where there's actually been accidental exposures and it's become clear what's toxic. There's obviously problems with developing exposure data in that it's not ethical to expose people to substances which we know are toxic just to see how much it takes to damage them. There are, however, a number of other instances or considerations such as economic, social or technological implications or sampling and analytical limitations which have also been taken into account in the assignment of exposure standards. So where we know that a substance is highly toxic, obviously we're not going to see how many people can be exposed to that without it being toxic to them. Exposure standards are never intended to be fine lines between safe and unsafe, and this point and these below need to be considered whenever you're using them. Controls should aim to keep exposures as low as practicable and not just meet exposure standards. So it's not just about compliance, it's about going beyond compliance where you possibly can. Exposure standards don't represent no effect levels, which will guarantee protection for all workers. However, they should protect nearly all workers from adverse health effects or discomfort, but we need to be aware that there's limits to the impact on all workers. Exposure standards are reviewed in the light of new information or hazard or health effects whenever necessary, or whenever those kind of effects come to attention of the authorities that set such things. They shouldn't be used as a measure of relative toxicity, so they shouldn't be compared, as they may be based on quite different biological effects. Comparison with exposure standards requires valid and appropriate measurements, and these need to be performed and interpreted by a competent person. There are a lot of exposure standards for hundreds of the commonly used chemical substances and physical agents such as noise, heat, cold, and ionizing or non-ionizing radiation, and that's what are contained in the database that was on the last slide. But if we can't find Australian standards, then the ACGIH1, the American Conference on Government Industrial Hygienists ones, are the ones that we tend to use. My caution would be very much so, if you don't have expertise in this area, if you don't know how to use an exposure standard, how to measure the exposure and do the comparison, if you're not really a hygienist, then you shouldn't be doing this. It needs to be done by an expert, and I would always get a hygienist to come in and do this kind of measurement for me. What we need to be able to do is understand and interpret the implications of those exposure standards and the measurements related to them in terms of controls that we need to implement and exposures that we need to manage. Exposure limits help us to evaluate and put in place preferred control measures. A review of these reminds us that they should be in what is generally agreed to as the hierarchy of controls. These have been described by lots of people, and you would have met them before in your OHS world, and we already talked about them in part 2 of this discussion. When we're looking at hazardous substances, clearly elimination is always the first and preferable objective, and it's a much better solution than any of the others. Engineering, isolation and substitution are the other preferred controls, and administrative and PPE controls are at the bottom of the hierarchy because they require behavioural change. Substitution usually involves replacing some material for another one, and in this case you might be substituting a safer chemical for one that is known to be hazardous. Isolation is putting up some sort of barrier which pushes a distance between the worker and the substances, and it's really a method of reducing exposure. It's not just wearing PPE, it's much more concrete, no pun intended, intersposing some sort of distance or barrier between the exposure and the person. Engineering controls may be things like barriers, they may be guarding, they may be local exhaust systems, or they may be other mechanical aids which reduce the exposure of the worker to the control. Administrative controls are usually setting up different systems of work, reducing the time of exposure by rostering or some such, excluding non-essential personnel, all those kind of things. And then personal protective equipment is widely used in this area, and we should always be really careful that the PPE that's prescribed is actually appropriate to the type of hazard that people are being exposed to. This is a nice flowchart from Tillman. I'm sorry it's not a terrific reproduction, but it gives you an idea of the fact that often there's a mix of control measures that are adopted. In the simplest case, the controls can be people controls, so people avoid unsafe acts, but we know that's inherently unreliable. For hazard controls, it's to eliminate the unsafe conditions, so going through that hierarchy of controls. And this chart is an example of the relationship between hazards, consequences and controls applied to gases and vapours, and it depicts how both the environment and the worker must be considered in the risk management process, and I think it's a really nice representation of that model of control. There's lots of information sources in this area, and as OHS professionals we need to keep up to date with recent developments and the latest information. So as quickly as I put up this stuff, there's going to be new stuff available, and to some extent I want you to tell us what you're aware of and what might be useful and share. But these are some basic ones. So there's different types of databases. There's factual ones and there's bibliographic ones, and I've listed a few of them there. The advantage of the factual ones, which tend to be online now, they still can sometimes get DVDs or CDs, but the online ones tend to generally be more up to date. And things like NICNAS, which we referred to in the workshops over the last couple of days on their on-campus days. ChemInfo is another really good one. The MSDS one, which is through the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health, is a really good one too, and it pulls together a number of others. These are immediate, but a lot of the bibliographic ones are good to go to where you want more in-depth information, or you want to explore further about the impact of particular substances in terms of hazards and exposures. There's a whole lot of international databases that you should be familiar with, and we'll refer back to a number of these at later stages in the modules too. But here's a list of some ones that I suggest you go and have a look at. ChemInfo, NIOSH, and I've put a little description of each of these. SysDoc, the RTEX one. The HSE line is a database which up till relatively recently was very easy to access, but I see, in line with a lot of the other things that HSE is doing now, that they've outsourced it. But it's still a good link to, if you go to that website, you'll see there's a link to a number of other sources that you can tap into. And MIDAS, a Major Hazard Incident Data Service, is also really useful. Another HSE ones, and again, good links to other areas. They seem to no longer host that, though they did for years. And we'll come back to more of these as we go through. There's a number of Australian databases and websites, and it's important for you to be familiar with these. There's the ones through Safe Work Australia, and there's other ones through local regulators. The Hazardous Substances Information System, the HISIS, you should go and have a look at, and it's there, and also NIGNAS, which was established in 1990, and it's through the Australian Government Department of Health and Ageing, which I always think is a fairly odd fit, but anyway, that's where we get it. Journals and texts, there's lots of journals. These are the sort of leading ones in the area, and you should become familiar with these, particularly when you're doing research for your various assessment tasks. And there's a number of texts there. The second one, sorry, not the second one, I've just lost a couple of those are actually available online as ebooks. She says, leafing back through her notes. Sorry. Yes, Lippmann and Cohen, which I haven't even got there. Sorry. Go back to the readings at the start of this, and the Brewer is the other one that's available as an ebook for the library, as you can see written there if I'd looked more closely. And there's lots of other resources that we'll talk to as we go through in future modules. I would recommend any of those three if you're going to buy them, but I particularly like the Tillman one. I think it's a really good little book. So in conclusion, there's a huge amount of information out there. There's lots of information on hygiene issues, so the hazards from exposures and the actual hazardous substances. And when we're doing management, we need to go and explore them, find them, be aware of them. Very often what you'll be doing is looking up a particular material as you come across it and have to deal with it. But it's good to have some general knowledge of where these are and how we might use them in the meantime. This is an introductory module, and we'll be expanding on a lot of this information later. So for your activity, I want you to assess at least of those three websites that I've referred to, or other resources, and explore them. I want you to make some notes on what you find in them, and I want you to come back and share those when we talk about this in Collaborate, particularly in terms of how you might apply this information in your own workplace OHS practice. Thank you. That's the recorded part for Module 1 for now.